Okie doke, review. All right, so last week we were dealing with the God paradox again. We were revisiting the machlokas, the dispute between the Bali Tosfos and the Rambam, that we saw a couple principles back. Where here in the third principle of the 13 principles of faith, the Rambam, as we would think, quite reasonably says, hey, God does not have a body. So we all roll with that, like, why not? Sounds good. But is not a universally held position amongst the early Rishonim. And again, this, like I said, this is a repeat of that previous machlokus, where the Rambam is taking on this idea that shlemus, that perfection, the definition of perfection is actualization, not potential, meaning you have to do something to be whole, to be perfect, to be shalem. And if that's the case, well, when you have to actualize something, there must be an internal logic. There must be some set of rules that enable actualization to make sense to begin with. The way Rav Sadia made it sound, the way he put it, was God cannot do anything absurd. So, for example, God cannot make a circle which has three sides. God can't kill himself. God can't take a vacation and hire someone else to take his job for a while. These are things God can't do, according to the position of the Rambam. And what goes on in line with this is, well, God also can't have a body. That's the Rambam's position. What I was kind of juxtaposing this then with Rav Moshe Teku. His idea of perfection, of shlemus, is potential, being able to do anything, anytime, anywhere. So for him, he could argue, the philosophical question, can God create a rock he can't lift? Rav Moshe Teku would say, yes, he can, and then he would lift it. He lives in a world of paradox, but again, the idea of paradox, in this sense, is boundless option. That's Rav Moshe Teku's position. So when confronted with the question, does God have a body? Well, Rav Moshe Teku says, of course, God can do anything. He has no limits, so he can have a body. Once more, in his attack against the Rambam, he says it's arrogant of us to disagree with the text, that the Chumash itself talks like Hashem has a body. Hashem has hands, he has faces, he runs around, he does all sorts of interesting stuff. Well, it's arrogant, says Rav Moshe Teku, to argue with the text. I offered the idea that, well, it can, number one, God doesn't have a body. That's the position I'm safely taking. So you guys coming out of here, Rabbi Bender says God has a body. No, I didn't say that. I'm a Rambam man, and so is Jewish history. We're Rambam people. That's why a lot of y'all got angry with me a little bit and argued, God doesn't have a body. Well, yeah, that's because we're Rambam people. But I think that Rav Moshe Teku can be forgiven because his argument is, well, it's kind of based, again, this idea, we'll trust the text. The text says it, why argue? Well, that's a really interesting argument to make because what he's really highlighting is this idea that, well, the Chumash, Judaism has proved itself. I mean, it's not just that the rest of humanity in the form of Christianity and Islam has actually taken on fundamentally that this text actually means something. It's withstood the test of time. That the Torah itself is a map of meaning that has worked out. If you want to escape suffering and pain, if you want to learn how to hold that, you have to make meaning out of it. And that's exactly what the Chumash, that's exactly what the Torah does. So for Moshe Teku, appreciating those points, he basically says, well, listen, again, the text proved itself. So who am I to argue with it? Even though we don't go with that way of, even though we don't agree on a philosophical level with Rav Moshe Teku, it's a very powerful argument to make. It's not so audacious of an argument to make when you put it in that way. We discussed nihilism and the idea of, well, being a nihilist is it's a philosophical joke. It's an unattainable position to believe that there is no such thing as meaninglessness. And I took a bit of an interesting position on that, in as far as, well, my proof that there is such a thing as meaning in the world is there is suffering. You'll never meet a person who doesn't have meaning in his pain. Pain is inherently meaningful. You're not going to meet a person who's having a hard time in life and is able to say to himself, nope, don't want it that way. If he could do that, well, that would be then a fair argument to demonstrate that pain does not have meaning. It's arbitrary. No one lives that way. I kind of gave this idea. I think it's a hard one to wrap your head around, but after World War II, all of humanity got together at the Nuremberg trials and basically said, listen, there is such a thing as objective truth. It was hard fought, to say the least. There is such a thing as objective morality. That it doesn't matter who you are, what culture you're from, doesn't matter what your beliefs are, there is a red line. Do not engineer sadistic, meaningless suffering of other people for your enjoyment. That's not good objectively. On the sign entering Auschwitz, it says, Arbeit macht free. Work will set you free. That's a sadistic joke. That is, I think, that's the best definition of evil. I think the difference between that joke and hell is an academic argument, to say the least. I think that's hell. That is the definition of evil. Now, it's a counterintuitive argument to make, but making that argument, there must be an opposite. Nihilism, the idea of meaninglessness, cannot stand because, well, we all agree that's pretty bad. Well, what's the opposite of that? Whatever the opposite of that's going to be good. That's going to be heaven on earth, I tell you what. So at the very least, it's standing against that. It's doing one's best to make it impossible for reasonless suffering of people. That's good. And that's just the beginning. At the very least, if you can take care of that, I think that people could agree that's a pretty good deal. But it doesn't have to end there. I mean, we don't know the limits of how good life can be. But it can be. And in previous classes, I also kind of demonstrated, as we go through the march of human history, life actually is getting better for everybody on every measure. On every measure of suffering. It's not even just getting better. It's dramatically, exponentially growing in the sense of getting better. No one in this room has to worry about guinea worms. Don't even ask me what that is. You don't have to worry about guinea worms. You just don't. There's less disease, there's less suffering, there's less poverty, there's less war. Even when there is war, there's less people suffering because of it. On every metric, things are getting better. There's less crime. I think I just saw a research paper a little while ago. The ozone layer has miraculously healed itself. I mean, when I was about your guys' age, everyone was talking about the big hole in the ozone. No, that's even getting better. Technologies are being created to get rid of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's going to get better. Things are actually getting pretty good. And it's we don't even know what the limit is to that. Nihilism is a philosophical joke. That was the argument I made. And that, again, a bit counterintuitive, but something worth to think about. No one can argue there's meaning in pain, and there's got to be an opposite. And talking about you don't even know the upper limits of how good this is. It just reminds me of a story of a clinician friend of mine. I know it's become in vogue that therapists go visit the Dalai Lama recently. I don't know. I've never met him, but I hear people have a good time doing it. And so a clinician, a colleague of mine, was visiting him, and around the same time there was another Buddhist monk who was visiting the Dalai Lama, and they were schmoozing, and it turned out that this other monk had ended up in a Chinese prison camp. And the Chinese don't like Buddhism. And the Dalai Lama asked him, well, how did you survive that? And the monk, and so, my clinician friend thinks, oh, well, that's a really good question. Well, how do you survive horrible torture? But that wasn't the conversation they were having. Because the monk responds, it did take a lot of work, but I never ended up hating them. The Dalai Lama wasn't asking about the suffering. They took it as a given, well, there is pain in the world, but that's not the point. The Dalai Lama was very much driving at this point. I'm trying to get across is you don't know how good this can get. He was really asking, how were you able to maintain your sense of compassion and love for all people and understanding and forgiveness? That's how good it can be if you can grab onto those values. And that's an individual who could do it. So we talked a little bit about, well, there are people who aren't going to agree to this. There are going to be people who are nihilistic. They're going to be cynical. How do you relate to them? And I think it's worthwhile taking a moment to think about that story about the Buddhist monk. Because not every cynic is cynical because he's a bad person. And that's usually how we paint cynics. People who don't agree with us, people are cynical. A lot of times maybe, people make this argument, oh, they're cynical because they don't want to take on responsibility in life. And that might be partly true. And for some people, that might actually be the reason. But I think that there's more of a more fundamental problem with cynics. In as far as it is hard, on a meta level, it is hard to give up one's personality. Being cynical is not something developed overnight, and it's a person's entire history, and however they got there, man, that is how they got there. And it's painful to give up one's personality because our personality is what gives us stability in our lives. As soon as we give up the idea of our identity, even the worst identity, is better than chaos. So there's something to be said for at least being a cynic. So okay, you meet a cynic, have some compassion. Arguing with the cynic is basically, even though you don't realize it, you're basically arguing, listen, I want you to be in chaos and give up your personality and everything that you've understood in your entire history. Well, that might be a good idea for the cynic, but that's a tall order to ask of somebody. It demands compassion. And it's also pretty scary to ask the cynic to entertain the idea, maybe your life didn't have to be as bad as it was. That's a kick to the gut. So just like this monk talking with the Dalai Lama, you're going to be confronted with people who, well, maybe it's not a cynic, but someone you don't agree with. That demands compassion. That demands a charitable view of how they got to where they were. Because whenever you're going to argue with somebody on deep philosophical grounds of, deep divides in how you see the world, your argument is demanding those two things. Give up your entire personality and live in chaos, which no one wants to do because that's scary. And number two, maybe your life didn't have to be as bad as it was. So have compassion. I don't know of any other answer other than that when confronted with that sort of problem. Just have compassion and charity for people. I ended with a third position in the Rishonim. Again, we had bringing this all back to the 13 principles of faith. We had the Ravid attacking the Rambam as well. Now, he's not siding with Ramosha Teku and the Bali Tosfos, but the Ravid's making the argument that the way he put it was that there are bigger and greater people in the Rambam who did hold such a misguided belief. And while it's true, we're not buying into the idea that God's running around having a body. Again, compassion is demanded here because these were great men who were well-intentioned, who sacrificed their life for Torah, and they had faith in the text. At the very least, how can anybody be faulted by trusting in the Torah, even if it's an incorrect position? Now, we're not living in times where people are running around arguing, does God have a body or not? Halachically speaking, we've developed way past that, but there is plenty of battlegrounds to be had in modern day Judaism. The Misnagdim and the Hasidim. Prime example. Who's right, who's wrong? Man, if I know. But one thing is sure, I think we should take the Ravid's advice when looking at other people we don't agree with on religiously speaking. How could they be faulted for trying to pursue the truth? And the last point we ended off with last week was on that very point, is that, Torah is a demand for action. It's not something that a search of truth is not parv. And that given the importance of truth demands action. We can't just allow, you have your position, you have your position and I have mine, we'll agree to disagree. No, disagree. Yeah, but with compassion. And then it might actually be more important. We have this idea coming from the Ron, one of the other Rishonim, that it might actually be a good idea to kind of think, maybe the process of searching for truth is more important than the conclusions. That in order to achieve greatness, in order to become bigger, in order to transcend, you have to put more limits on yourself. And from this perspective, those limits are the things you believe. Do you make the bracha on Natilas Yadayim before you get your hands wet or after? From such a mundane machlokus, such as that, to the big guns in Jewish law. Ideas of Rodev, things like that. These are serious questions in how to behave. And every step of the way, you have to make a decision, because each time you make a decision, it's almost like you're building your own ladder up to Shemayim. Every rung has to be strong, and the only way to climb that ladder is making, with intelligence, with responsibility, with guidance, but still nonetheless making clear decisions. And those decisions limit you, but by limiting you, that's what enables you to climb that ladder, to transcend. I don't know, kind of a funny way of thinking about it is, want to play a game? Any volunteers? All right, it's your move.
Okay. What game are we playing?
It's your turn.
Okay.
In order to play this game, we need to have limits. It's like when I gave you potential, I gave you infinite options just now. And quite reasonably, you're a reasonable human being. You look at me like I'm an idiot. It's like, okay, man, what are we doing? But we can't do something meaningful unless I make rules. Unless I tell you, there are steps, and I limit options. And if I were to do that, then okay, then you would actually been able to do something. But that's the point of transcendence, is if you want to play the game of life, you have to have rules. That's just a small example. Otherwise, you're confronted with too much potential, and potential itself crushes you. You can't act. So that's my argument for making choices and standing by them, because they enable you to make the next choice and the next choice and the next choice. And I think this is the very idea of when the Jews were trying to get out of communist Russia, it almost became like a slogan, let my people go. It was a riff off, we just had Parshas Bo, it was like a riff off Moshe, let my people go. But they never actually finished the pasuk. Let my people go in order to serve me. In order to free yourself of slavery, you have to make yourself a slave to something else. Because again, like otherwise you're just crushed by potential and can't act. Okay. I want to move on to the fourth principle of faith that the Rambam outlines in Perplexed. Yeah, only 2 classes for one principle. That was pretty good, right?
I was confused.
I know. I was like, there's got to be another 5, right? You know what? Okay, fine. You're taunting me. I'm going to schlep this one out. This is a really cool thought. I mentioned this is kind of related to the very first class we had where I was presenting to you guys the idea that the whole objective of life, why God created humanity to begin with, was to learn how to love. That was what I was putting forward to you guys. And in that description, in the way that the Kabbalists kind of describe, like God created humans and we're neshamas hanging out in Shemayim. There's enough new people I can retell old stories. So there's we're all hanging out in Shemayim as neshamas and God's just like loving us. We're like, well, what are you doing? Like, what is this? Like, it didn't make sense to us.
I'm the only OT person.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so so it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to us, and so God said, "Okay, this is a problem. I'm going to have to create a world where the whole objective of reality is for you guys to figure out what love is." Because if you can kind of imagine it, this sort of scenario is almost like some stranger running up to you off the street, giving you a big hug and saying, "I love you." You call the cops. Like that would be scary. So that's exactly what humanity was going through as neshamas, as these disembodied spirits. And so Hashem's solution, and I think a part of it is, that we didn't have form, we didn't have shape. There was no reference point to make sense of love. And so God's solution was to create restriction, to create boundaries, to create form, to create a world now where we all have to act out what love is. And the more efficient and effective we are in acting out love, 2 things are going to happen. You're actually going to feel better in life. And the world's going to get better around you. You're going to figure out that love actually is good because it produces good. But the only way to do that was, God had to create form to do that. So I present this idea of, this is very similar to the problem that artificial intelligence researchers ran into when they tried to create robots with artificial intelligence. They wanted the robots to see, to understand form and understand shape. And they immediately were confronted with the problem is, you cannot create robots to understand shapes, form. They can't see. They had accidentally stumbled on something called the frame problem. Modern philosophers look at the frame problem as the biggest problem to tackle within the last 50 to 100 years. Meaning, how do you sort out shapes? I know it sounds like a dumb question to ask, but when they were creating robots, and they went, a simple picture of a tree with a dog behind it. Well, we'd all interpret, we wouldn't look at that with, the head on one side and the tail on the other side and a tree in the middle. Like, we wouldn't say that's one object. We'd kind of fill it in our brains. That's a dog behind a tree. But that's arbitrary. There really is no biological explanation that really, really answers why we can see. In fact, half our brain is organized just seeing alone. And most of our seeing is actually trying to edit out all of the distractions that are around us. And we actually end up only seeing the things we're looking for, what matters to us. I mean, that was the gorilla experiment I shared with you guys. If you're counting how many balls are being passed, that's all you see. You miss the gorilla walking on stage. So it's like, again, this sort of arbitrariness. Well, like, why don't we see on the quantum level? Like, why don't we see on a particle level? Why don't we see countries? Why don't we see culture? Like we as living creatures, and everything is couched almost like this Russian doll, one doll inside the other, on these multiple levels of seeing, and we're all interrelated to the point where it is actually being argued, well, maybe shapes are arbitrary. This kind of is a little bit of a nod, I think, to the Rambam in his argument of God doesn't have a body, because, well, God kind of is outside the frame problem. He's formless, therefore everything. I mean, when you read Kabbalistic books talking about Hashem, they're always very paradoxical. He is everything and nothing. I mean, it makes sense of that. Well, kind of the frame problem actually kind of makes a little sense of that. And you start it starts getting a little more funny. Well, if that's the case, there is something to this idea of Klal Yisrael or Ravim Zed Bezed, this idea that you can make Kiddush for somebody. Why? If you really are fundamentally a different entity, well, how could you say Kiddush, everyone else says Amen, and somehow everyone's fulfilled the mitzvah? That's weird. Unless there's something to the frame problem. Maybe the boundaries we see in the world are just that, arbitrary. And so artificial intelligence guys make that argument. And what they ended up doing, the way to get around the problem of helping robots see, it wasn't the programming. They ended up making bodies for the robots, and then all of a sudden they could see. Give a robot a hand, it can see for whatever reason. By limiting it, now it is in your arbitrary frame. I guess that's the one way of thinking of it. So it's like, okay, that's kind of interesting. Maybe we're a little more connected than we think. And like I said, goes a long way in pushing another. Not that the Rambam needs me to add any other justifications to his belief God doesn't have a body, but this is a pretty good modern day proof to the idea that God doesn't have a body. All right, so that's something to think about. The frame problem, interesting idea. Okay, the fourth principle. We got a couple problems to this one, so we're just going to dive into it and we'll sort ourselves out a little bit.
Wait, tell me.
And then maybe I'll have time. I'll have time to be a nerd at the end and talk about how the shape of the universe. I hope I can talk about it. It's just for me, guys. It's just for me. Okay, so the fourth principle reads like this. So the Rambam writes that the fourth principle is that Hashem is beyond time. This means that the one God we have described in the second and third principle is absolutely eternal. He's first. And that everything that exists apart from him cannot be eternal in comparison to him. The Rambam gives a couple proofs from Psukim. So know that the most fundamental principle of the Torah of Moshe, our teacher, is that the world was created and formed new. God brought it into existence from a state of absolute nothingness. The reason that you will see that I've described at length the issue of the eternity of the world, which is the view of the philosophers, is to demonstrate conclusively that God exists, as I have explained and clarified in Moreh Nevuchim. Okay. As I've read to you, this is the new updated version of the fourth principle. If you look in a classic Gemara, Mishnah, the Rambam ends right before he starts talking about Yesh Ma'ayin, creation from nothingness. Originally, the fourth principle mentioned nothing about creation from nothingness. It just mandated the belief that God is absolutely eternal and that he created time, and that was about it. But later in life, the Rambam was constantly editing his works. And in fact, really, the 13 Principles, he had actually written much early on. I think it was like 30-something when he wrote the 13 Principles of Faith. So he updated it. So he added that. That's problem number one is, well, why did that not exist in the first edition? Like, what changed there? Problem number two is his citation of Moreh Nevuchim. It says, and if you want to hear all about this idea, go look at my other really cool book, and I get into it there. So if you were to go look at Moreh Nevuchim, you have a very big problem, because early on in the text, when the Rambam is presenting proofs for the existence of God, he takes as assumed Aristotle's belief of a universe that always existed. He takes the position, not yesh ma'ayin, in order to prove God's existence, and then doubles back and says, well, no, I actually don't believe this. So I thought it might be worth going through, well, what are the three different philosophical options of the state of the universe? What can we learn from, well, what's the Rambam's trick here? What is he trying to get at? Because, this is a glaring contradiction. And like I said, maybe I can nerd out and talk about the shape of the universe and whether or not the universe is going to contract on itself dramatically and painfully. Or will continue to grow.
No, please do.
Teaser. All right, yeah, thank you. Not the only nerd. That's great. Okay. So we got three positions of creation. They more or less are reflected in modern day cosmology. The first is the traditional Jewish view of yesh ma'ayin. There was nothing, and then God decided there should be something. Straightforward. The second view is expressed by Aristotle and his buddies, that there was always like a physicalness of the world. It always existed. And that the physicalness of the universe exists parallel with the first mover, which is God, and they both are eternal. That's option number two, and all God does is he shuffles the cards of reality, so to speak. He plays around with objects, he makes things out of stuff, but that's all he does. That's option number two presented. And the last one is the view of the Platonists, Plato and his buddies, which is, he puts forward this idea that there was like what's a good way of putting it? Like a primordial chaotic substance. Like he kind of agrees with Aristotle a little bit, like almost like, no pun intended, but Plato's idea was there was something like Plato that existed. And this Plato was eternal. And what God did, Hashem came along, and he took the Plato and he made it into something. Those are the three classic views of creation. Now in Moreh Nevuchim, like I said, for proving God's existence, the Rambam, it almost like he's playing a devil's advocate argument that, even in your world of God, the materialness of the universe being eternal, I can still prove the existence of God. And he does. Which is kind of a cool trick. It's not as though it's almost like playing around with the idea that truth is so powerful that you might have some of your facts wrong, but truth is so powerful it will present itself, even if some of your facts are incorrect. And that such a powerful truth can even be manifest in a situation that, well, it would be reasonable to not believe in God. If it really is true that the physicalness of reality has always been, well, what purpose do you have for a creator? None, because there's nothing to create. So the Rambam becomes a devil's advocate and says, well, even in this interesting hypothesis that the physical world has always existed, I can prove, based on logic and reason, that there still needs to be a God, and he does. And he has like I forget, around 30-some proofs for the existence of God, even in such a world that the physical world was already there.
Is it kind of like, would you equate it to like in a video game, there's like those characters that haven't been unlocked yet? They're still created and all of their strengths and weaknesses, they're there, but we just haven't unlocked it yet. Would it be equated to that? Like the earth was always there in its state and as God was, and just over the gradual excess of time, then one day it's just kind of like, now we're going to put it into action. Would that be the same, or am I thinking of it in the wrong way?
I hear what you're saying. It almost sounds like the third view of Plato. That
Okay.
there's like this, there's a lack of form, and then God brings form forth from the Plato. Again, sounds more like that, but it is the way you're putting it is different. But it seems more like that. But no, I mean for Aristotle, it really was like there's stuff. Stuff always existed. So I think that's what the Rambam was doing there, which is kind of a cool idea. Again, this idea that truth the things that are really true will come out even if some of the facts don't exactly line up. It's hard to hide truth. You can't quite cover it up. Truth is too big to be hidden. The Rambam, a couple sentences later, says, listen, we go with the Chumash. Chumash says that God just created, Yesh Ma'ayin, great. We'll go with that. That's the more simplistic read, says the Rambam. But he says something really funny. He says that the Platonic view could actually be justified within Judaism, but that it's too complex. There's too many things you need to assume, so why do it? If an idea is too complex, on the one hand, in explaining whatever it is you're trying to explain, and you have another explanation which is just way more clean, way more simple, the Rambam is making the argument, go with that.
Is the one that like the Plato thing does make sense? Is it like Tohu Vavohu where like Hashem created?
Yeah, it would be exactly that. The Tohu Vavohu always existed, and Hashem brought forth from Tohu Vavohu the world.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah. The Ramban says something very similar in his understanding of creation. He does posit that sort of procedure that, well, he says, first Hashem created the Plato, and then he started playing around and bringing form and order to that chaos. So the Ramban is almost like Plato, except nope, the goo was created too. That's what he would argue. So this sort of way of thinking about, well, how to have ideas. You guys ever hear of Occam's razor?
Yes.
Yes, this is Occam's razor. If you have two theories of explaining something, it's not a law, it's not always true, but if you have two really good competing theories of how to explain something, pick the simplest explanation. Pick the one that requires the less defense, the less amount of dancing. Now that's a really interesting thing to kind of bring out, because it's almost like, well, what's the alternative of Occam's razor? If you want to have beliefs or thoughts that if you don't adopt this, well, what ends up happening is, like, let's say you have a theory, leprechauns exist. This is a good example.
I'm down.
You're down, right?
I'm down.
Right. I mean, there is no foolproof argument to prove leprechauns don't exist, because what you could always do is come up with an ad hoc explanation why. Well, I've never seen a leprechaun. Oh, it's because they're invisible. Okay. Well, I've never been touched by a leprechaun. Oh, it's because they can pass through objects. You can always create a more complicated justification for your belief.
Maybe they just don't want to touch you.
Yeah, maybe they just don't want to touch. Yeah. You smell, they're running away.
they require personal space.
What I thought it was. Okay, I guess we'll have to stop
Zoe's
on.
actually allowed.
I guess we'll have to stop on this point. I won't be able to get
the
into
Irish
the
anyway.
get into the
No.
the nerd out.
Rabbi, you
But
teach me.
it's a really good rule to take from a Rishon, especially in a religion that there is a lot of room for. Well, maybe there's a miracle. Hold on, let's define our terms. Miracles' functions are to prove the existence of God. Not everything that happens in your life, I lost my wallet and then someone brought it to me. It's a miracle. No, it's not.
It is.
It's not a miracle. It is not God parting the clouds and declaring I exist. It's not. And so there is a compulsion that if there are more options of explaining things, i.e., will miracles happen? Well, wait a second. That is true. There is such a thing as miracles, but you have to hesitate in offering those sort of explanations for life or buying it from other people. I mean, that's the bigger problem, is use Occam's razor, because that's what the Rishonim do. Chavos Levavos also offers this a similar approach. You always adopt the simplest explanation. Now, there are times in human history that the simplest explanation didn't always work out. Maybe the ad hoc hypothesis was correct. The one example that comes to mind was, when Albert Einstein put forward his theory of relativity, he's trying to describe gravity. That's what the theory of relativity really is. It's a description of the physical nature of gravity. What gravity is time and space. It's a physical substance. It's very much in line with the fourth principle. Time is a created thing. Well, that's what the theory of relativity describes. And within that theory, Einstein he threw in some ad hoc hypotheses because he was kind of tackling, how is it that gravity won't at some point take the universe and crunch it? So he got complicated. And he posited something which more or less resolves the problems of why gravity wouldn't crunch the universe back together. But then his buddy Hubble comes along and says, hey, look through my telescope. And they were able to observe the universe is constantly expanding. So Einstein gave up that part of his theory of the cosmological constant. But it turned out to be true. So it's sometimes maybe leprechauns are invisible. Maybe you can't see them. Maybe they are. But ideally, it's never a good idea to just adopt that as your go-to to try and defend whatever beliefs you have. Don't necessarily assume leprechauns exist. The more simple, straightforward belief is they don't. Might be wrong. But Occam's razor pays off.
Zoe, you're partially Irish.
Yeah.
Yes.
Have I already made the Irish potato famine joke?
Yep.
Okay.
You go for it.
But isn't that kind of a simple-minded way of thinking and not really the full potential of who we are as humans?
That what?
By taking the simplest route and just not going into all the options.
It's only if it makes things more simple so you can prove it and reproduce it. It's pragmatic. Things that are super duper complex rarely can be reproduced. They're usually not so helpful to other people. And it's almost like the more unproven theories you collect in life, they can weigh you down. And some of them will be right and some will be wrong. But those that are wrong are really going to get in the way. Kind of gets back to the idea of, truth's pretty strong and it shines through, but man, it can get covered over pretty quick. And so I hear your point, but in a sense, that's the beauty of adopting that sort of worldview is attempt to always have the most simple, straightforward explanation for something. Because then whatever you're certain that's true. It's you're able to justifiably you should have 3 boxes you put thoughts in life. Things that are certainly true. using Occam's razor, you'll really know what certainly true is. Then you have two other boxes of, well, what's for sure not true, and what could be true you don't know one way or another. But otherwise, those two boxes of, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, or certainly not true, a lot of times they accidentally get thrown into the box of that's for sure true. And that just it stalls up development. And so what I found, again, and I'm just saying, like, it's not always true. Like, your point's well taken. But, you look at, well, the question of, like, well, why is it that technology just expands so rapidly? I mean, like, that's nuts. All of it, like, it's nutty how quick technology is developing. I think it's something like, every 2 years, the memory capacity of a microchip doubles. I mean, like, it's just dramatic. And one of the primary reasons is this basic assumption, this guideline. Always have the simplest explanations, because then what you sure know. It's less ambiguous. So I think we'll end here. We'll have to save the nerd stuff for next class. Any questions?
I was wrong.
Or you were robbed.